I'd like to ask you, you've also spent time in Afghanistan, the other major conflict area for the United States in the region. Your sense of how the U.S. involvement is going there and what obviously President Obama is expanding it and what the prospects are for the U.S. occupation there?
It's certainly a very long-term approach they're taking. 10, 15 years down the line, and the most successful, so the best case scenario for them is Afghanistan will end up looking somewhat like Chad after billions of dollars being spent, thousands of lives being lost, and very little progress to show, I think. Certainly there is a different approach. They've, under the Obama administration, and they've brought some of the wiser people in the military and civilian side of the administration to focus on this. I'm skeptical that it can succeed. I'm even skeptical that there's a reason why the U.S. should be in Afghanistan. I don't think that al-Qaeda is a very significant threat. I think there are more important things to worry about. And certainly I think a better way to protect the U.S. from al-Qaeda is not by occupying Afghanistan and bombing Pakistan, which only creates more enemies, but perhaps continuing to focus on police activity, on preventative measures, on the borders in Europe, in the U.S. Every time you kill a Pakistani or an Afghan, you are creating new members of the Taliban. There are differences, of course. The international presence in Afghanistan is far more popular than it ever was in Iraq. But Afghanistan is a much more difficult terrain. There are not enough troops, there are no roads practically. I mean, it's like operating in an environment of 100,000 years ago. And until now, unlike in Iraq, where the surge actually happened to coincide at a time when Iraqi dynamics had shifted, when the violence had almost burned itself out in a way, and the U.S. could almost piggyback on that and then claim success for the surge. Things in Afghanistan are continuing to get worse and worse. The countryside is in the hands of the Taliban. But Obama certainly reduced his expectations, being very clear that this is the main goal is merely to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for al-Qaeda, and in a way focusing more on Pakistan, realizing there isn't really much you can do. Pakistan is the main problem, after all. You could turn Afghanistan into Sweden, theoretically, after 1,000 years, but Pakistan remains the main danger from an American point of view, of course. Nuclear weapons, it's the base for whatever al-Qaeda elements remain, base for Taliban, it antagonizes India, and it seems like a really insoluble problem, especially when the Pakistani security forces themselves are implicated in these attacks. And we see the attacks shifting not only from tribal areas, but even in Punjab, you had 2 attacks in Lahore. It doesn't look like it's going to be easy.
Nir Rosen, what do you think is driving President Obama to expand the war when allies around the Western world, NATO, are pulling out, like Canada, for example? I mean, President Obama himself, some might argue he's president because he opposed the war in Iraq, and that was the main difference between him and Clinton and, of course, McCain, yet he's expanding in Afghanistan. Well,
Democrats certainly objected to the war in Iraq in part because it shifted attention away from the needs of Afghanistan, and perhaps you wouldn't be in a situation in Afghanistan today had proper attention in terms of aid and civilian development been given to Afghanistan early on. And of course, there are issues of American prestige. Can an empire like the U.S. withdraw from a country in seeming defeat? But I think Obama's administration is dominated by proponents of population-centric counterinsurgency, people who believe the surge in Iraq did succeed, people who believe that they can do this. These are very smart people, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps a little too smart, very confident in their ability to succeed in Afghanistan from what I've seen. If they only pour enough troops, focus on protecting the population. I mean, the Taliban, of course, are not really popular in Afghanistan. It's just that the government is really hated as well. I've even spoken to some proponents of Obama's policies who view this as a morally necessary approach, which is rare to hear these days, the introduction of morality into this. In part, these are people who throw acid in the faces of schoolgirls on their way to school, things like that. I was told yesterday by somebody close to the administration on this, this is kind of like the perfect confluence of American national security interest in preventing al-Qaeda from having a safe haven and the American moral obligations, preventing the sorts of people who throw acid in the faces of girls going to school from seizing power in a country. There's a real sense that we did this surge in Iraq, we succeeded, we understand what was wrong with the U.S. military approach before, and we can succeed in Afghanistan. I remain skeptical based on my own time there that the military can do this, but it's certainly very different from Iraq. It's important to say that Afghan civilians continue to die in large numbers at the hands of Americans, of course at the hands of the Taliban as well. But I think that whenever it's more important to address perhaps the root causes of all this. Al-Qaeda isn't a group that just was born one day and people decided they want to kill Americans. I think the road to peace in Afghanistan, like the road to better relations with all Muslims, is through Palestine. And if something is done to create the impression that the U.S. is maybe a more fair actor in Palestine, then one of the main grievances, one of the main reasons people have for attacking the U.S. or for resenting the U.S. will be removed.
Nir Rosen, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Nir Rosen is a fellow at the NYU Center on Law and Security, as well as the New America Foundation, just back from Iraq and before that, Afghanistan. His book is called In the Belly of the Green Bird, The Triumph of the Martyrs in Iraq. This is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from New York and North Carolina. Back in a minute.